Welcome to the aXcelerate Learning Series. In this lesson, we'll be covering the following topics. Each section is bookmarked and timestamped for easy navigation. You can also adjust your video playback speed to suit your own pace. To help you get the most out of this lesson, we do recommend that you download our notes guide within the description box below, and do take notes as you go through the video to help form questions for the Q&A session. I'll hand you over to our expert now. Happy learning.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's lesson where we'll be looking at aXcelerate's basic finance features. In this lesson, we'll be covering a number of things. We'll be looking at the setup of aXcelerate's basic finance settings, how to set your prices for courses and other items, how to raise invoices and send those out of the system, and the fundamentals of managing payments and refunds within the aXcelerate context. Generally speaking, aXcelerate has a number of finance-related features, and these are grouped into the families of invoice generation and sending, stuff we'll be looking at here today, but also other features such as managing government funding. That more advanced stuff we'll be considering in a later lesson. I wish to make clear that as a general rule, aXcelerate is not actually accounting software. It is very much invoice generation software. This means while it has a capacity to raise an invoice and send it out, it doesn't have any capacity to actually move money around or manage accounts. When we record a payment in aXcelerate, we're effectively just marking that invoice as paid. The actual transaction has been processed by some sort of external software. With this in mind, it is important to recognize that aXcelerate does have a number of integrations with external software such as Xero or MYOB for managing accounts, and also eWay and EasyPay, payment gateways that can manage credit card payments. We won't be looking at any of those integrations in today's session, but if you have any questions or you're curious about that, I do strongly recommend you check out our documentation on the topics or reach out to your onboarding consultant for some of the finer points. Regardless of what integration you're considering, it is still worthwhile to look at and understand the very basics of aXcelerate's invoicing and payments capabilities. That way you'll have a fundamental understanding of what any integration is actually trying to do. It'll inform how to best set it up. Lastly, before we dive into the settings and setup of today, I would like to point out that you may see we are in the staging environment here today. We have the STG in that top URL bar. Generally, as a rule, it's a good idea to set up and practice with any finance features in aXcelerate within the staging environment first. This is because some financial setup, like raising invoices, setting some C numbers, that can be quite difficult to remove once you've put it in there. So in these early stages, we recommend that you do things in staging to build confidence with how they are going to work. Once you're sure of how your setup is going to function, then you can implement that stuff in the live environment with confidence. All right, with that out of the way, with our understanding of what we'll be covering and the limitations therein, let's move on to getting into the basic finance settings of your system. So here we are in aXcelerate within staging. As mentioned, we're going to be doing our examples here today. So we've got a nice practice run in the staging environment. And the first thing we need to do is actually ensure that our base level finance settings are configured. Right now, aXcelerate has no real capacity to even produce an invoice as we don't have those set. So to get there, we're going to navigate to this little gear on the top menu bar, and we're going to dive down into our system settings here. Once we're through, we're going to jump across to our additional options tab. And this is actually where most of the basic finance settings are stored alongside some others. Scrolling down, the key thing that we'll touch on, the main thing that we'll need to proceed today, start with this invoice setup over here. We have a prefix and a padding, but I want to first point out this seed number like so, which has not been set. This is effectively the first number of the first invoice that will be generated out from aXcelerate. Once this is set, it'll count ordinally up from there. So if I put the number 1, like so, it means the first invoice generated will have the number of 1. That will literally be it. Then the next invoice will have 2, and so on and so forth, to 3, 4, and 5. You can also set this at a higher number where it will count from there. So if I made this as invoice 55, the first invoice generated will be 55, the next one will be 56, then 57, and so on and so forth. So if you're looking to continue an invoicing system, you can set the seed number higher to match that. If you're thinking of just starting afresh with the aXcelerate platform, you can simply set it as 1 and go from there. I've clicked off that now, and do note that it is warning us once we put a seed in place, we cannot change it. We have to keep that record to track the consistency of invoices. So it is important to make sure you're certain of what your seed should be before setting it. This is a big reason that we are doing things here in staging so that we can see how it works. If we're unhappy with it, we can make sure we choose a different option when we set it up in live. Now, naturally, you may not want the invoice seed to be just 1, that's the only number. You may want it to have some leading zeros or a prefix in front of it, and that's what these 2 fields are for. So for example, if you want the letters INV in front of that for like invoice, we could simply put that into the prefix like so. Under this model, the first invoice generated out of the system would be INV1 exactly. Unlike the seed, we have the flexibility to change this at any later point, so you can adjust that if you're unhappy with it at a later point. Below that, we have the padding down in here, and this is a function to ensure that the invoice number is X many characters long. So right now it's at 0, so the first invoice would be INV1. If we set this to say 2, that means that the numbers need to be at least 2 characters. So the first invoice would actually be INV01. It will add in extra zeros as padding to ensure it meets the length that you're after. Similarly, if we move this up to 3, the first number would be INV001. Much like the prefix, the padding can be adjusted to whatever you so wish, so you can move that at a later date. For anyone considering the use of MYOB, MYOB, I just want to warn you that if you set this too high, this can result in issues as highlighted here, where the invoice total is too long. So in this case, it would be INV, then 7 zeros, and then a 1. Within MYOB, I won't accept that. It'll actually be way too large. So for other users, people using Xero or not integrating with the platform, less of a concern, but just something to keep in mind if you're targeting that integration. I'm going to reduce this down. I'm just going to make this 3. Thus, my first invoice will be INV001. Moving on, we can see below that, we also have this due date offset down in here. So when you raise an invoice in aXcelerate, it will apply a due date to it, and this defines exactly how much that should be from the default. So there'll be the invoice date, the date the invoice is created, and this is set to 7, so the due date will be exactly 7 days after an invoice is raised. You may have different due dates. Perhaps you're a bit more generous. You could say, no, normally when we raise an invoice, we give people 30 days to pay it. So we could say the default number is 30, for example. We could also reduce that back to say, no, you have until tomorrow to pay when we raise an invoice. This is merely a default. This can be overridden at the individual invoice level. Not every invoice has to respect this day here, but if you have a very commonly applied due date, I recommend filling it into here to just save time raising each individual invoice. Furthermore, as well as the invoice setup, you may have caught we have a similar looking area down below for credit notes. Now, setting these up here, the padding, prefix, and seed, that is required in order to raise an invoice at all. Credit notes are in some ways, in some respects with aXcelerate, considered kind of like reverse invoices. An invoice is a document you raise to say that a student owes us this much money. When you receive a payment for that, you then apply a payment to the invoice to reconcile the balance or difference there. A credit note is almost the opposite. It is a document reflecting the money you owe a student when, say, you're giving out a refund. Once you have processed the refund and given the money back, you apply a refund to the credit note to show that that's been reconciled. So it's almost like this is money in, whereas this will be money out. So in order to be processing refunds, we'll need credit notes. Thus, we will need to also give it prefix, padding, and seed as well. We can give it a very similar setup. We can give it a starting seed number of 1, same level of padding, but to differentiate it, I'm going to give this the prefix of CN. So the first credit note we create will be CN001 under this arrangement here. That's pretty much all we need for our initial finance settings in this menu. There will be more to set up in terms of pricing and what we call finance codes in order to actually get to that invoice stage, but we will be looking at that in a moment. Before we leave these very basic settings here, I wish to point out that for anyone looking to use a finance integration, such as MYOB, Xero, eWay, what have you, you will need to do further setup within the web and other integrations area of aXcelerate. For more information on that, I do recommend checking out our relevant documentation, as the setup process is a little different depending on the platform you are choosing. All right. So we've covered our basic finance settings here. We'll now move on to setting up more of the prices and what we call finance codes. Hope to see you there. Welcome back. As you may just recall, we've just gone through and set our initial finance settings, namely our prefix, padding, and seed for our credit notes and invoices. We're now going to move on and start looking at setting up the pricing and finance codes for our actual specific courses. Before we do that, I'm just going to save our settings in here to lock them in place. And you'll see that that has now locked in the seed numbers. We can no longer change those. Again, as a reminder, that's a big reason we're doing this first in staging for demonstration, so that if we've set the wrong seed number, we can change our mind when we set it up in the live environment. All right, so got our basic finance settings in place. We're now going to move on and look at something that we call finance codes. These are also known as GL codes, general ledger codes in some platforms, and they more or less reflect different amounts, different costs within an accounting system. Even if you are not integrating with accounting software, you will still need to set some finance codes just so aXcelerate can tell what different amounts of money are, what those amounts really belong. To set these up, we'll go to the finance menu up the top here, and you'll see that there's a section here for finance codes. I'm going to click through now. Here we are. The system has detected that we have no finance codes at all in the current system, so it's prompting us to create our first one now. I will be creating these manually today, as we will not be looking at an integration with any external software. However, I do want to caution anyone considering the use of MYOB or Xero. In those platforms, they will already have their own finance or GL codes. In those contexts, it's very important that you import those codes from those softwares. You do not want to create them manually in aXcelerate. That will not lead to a well-functioning integration. So although I'll be doing it manually here today, please understand that depending on your integration, you may have to change your process. Again, I recommend checking out the relevant documentation on either setup of those platforms for what to do. So let's go ahead and create some finance codes. As you can see, we can set a number of things, but we only really need the description and code itself. So I'm going to use the finance code of 200, and I'm going to give it the description of course fees. So whenever we charge for accredited training within this system, we're going to use the finance code of 200. That'll designate that specific amount. If necessary, I could tie this to a locational domain. If I've got a particularly complicated finance setup, maybe I've got a ton of different GL codes for certain regions. In this context, no, pretty much everyone's going to use this if they charge course fees. Doesn't really matter where they're based. We can also fill in additional codes in here, but these mainly have implications for integrations with external software. We won't really need these to continue with the basic finances of today. Further down, I can also set this finance code as the default thing to use for certain aspects of the system. So you see there are a number of different items relating to just different things we can charge for, and we'll be delving in where this is actually all drawn from. So for example, if any single accredited full qualification would use this finance code for its tuition fees, I could just tick that in there and say, yeah, very much just use that as a default constantly. You may not have such a broad context. Maybe you have a bunch of different codes, different ones for different qualifications, perhaps. In that case, you would want to leave this unticked, and you can be a bit more specific about that. And I'll show you where that can be set. So I'll leave this as is, no defaults for now, and then we'll go down to the bottom and hit submit to create that finance code. There we go. We have our first code sitting pretty in here. We can continue adding more to this. I can go up top and add another finance code. I'm going to make another one, as we may want to track costs for things that aren't strictly tuition, aren't just course fees. Maybe we've got some material costs, we sell additional items to the students, or maybe we're running admin fees, so things that are related to it, maybe a re-enrollment fee or something like that, where it's not really what you normally pay for a course, but we need to track that cost still. For that reason, I'm going to make another one called admin fees. and give it a code of 201. Something simple like that. With that in place, we can repeat the process and hit submit, and we've got our second finance code in there. We could continue making more, but this should be sufficient for what we're looking at here today. Now that we have our finance codes, our GL codes, we know what certain amounts are, we can go ahead and start setting the pricing that those amounts will be drawing from. You may have already looked at this, may have already set some up due to what you've seen in previous lessons, but as a refresher, I'll show you the two main areas that you can set up pricing for your accredited or even non-accredited courses in this case. Let's start with full qualification, so something like an entire Certificate 3. Setting the price for those should be done at the qualifications level of the system. So I'm going to click in here, and we can see we've already got a few qualifications in, like so. But if we want to take a look at the pricing, we must click inside the qual. So I'm going to go to this aging course, like so. And scrolling down a bit further, you will see that there are two fields here for the cost and the finance code. Now the cost has already been set as 5,000. It's important to understand that this is just a general idea of what it should cost. We will be able to change this per individual class that we set up and for individual students. We aren't at this point saying everyone must always pay 5,000. There may be variance within that. But if generally speaking, for this qualification, most people are going to pay 5,000, there's no harm sitting in it here, thus it will help pre-fill things later down the track. One thing that isn't set is a finance code. Previously we didn't have any, thus we couldn't actually fill in this field. But now that we do, we should be able to drop this open and say this 5,000 is part of the course fees, like so. Furthermore, I wish to make clear that this here should only refer to the tuition cost of the course. In total, a student may pay more. Perhaps it's 5,000 in tuition and then there's just a $100 extra enrollment fee on top of that. If that is the case, we do not want to set this up as 5,100 because that $100 is not part of the tuition. We will be able to accommodate that, but I'll show you in a little bit how that works in the additional items area. Now that we've seen how to set the price for a full qualification, let's consider a smaller case. Let's say you're running a short course or a small non-accredited course. As has been seen in previous lessons, we do not set up everything for those in the qualification level. The majority of that is in fact done within what we call the workshop types. Those define the parameters of those short courses. So if I click through here, you can see we have a short course type in here for first aid and CPR. And if I click on through onto that type, you'll see down here that we have two different pricing rates, like so. This one here is the public workshop rate. So if you just offer a course to the general public, people book in, each student's their own individual, that is how much we're saying each person should pay. So 50 bucks a pop. Again, this should really just refer to the tuition of it. So if this CPR course, it's $50 to show up, but then maybe you've got to pay an extra $20 for a first aid kit, that too would be reflected elsewhere. We wouldn't make that $70, we would keep that $50 and set up the first aid kit as a separate item. The counterpart below that is the in-house delivery fee. So this here refers to the single flat cost of the course that if we offered it to a corporate client. So in those contexts, rather than invoicing each individual student, you would normally send maybe one invoice to a corporate client to say, hey, those 10 students you have, can you pay for those? Here's your lump sum fee. This here defines a simple flat rate. So it doesn't matter how many people you enroll, it's just $5,000 up front. That would be the amount there. Again, remember that these are not fully defining it. We will be able to modify that cost per individual instance. So if we ran this on a certain date with a certain person, we'd be able to override that 5,000 cost. But this is just the general default to help us pre-fill things later. If you charge at a per person rate, even when you offer to corporate clients, that's what this group pricing tool here is for. If you don't see this option, feel free to reach out to our support team. It is a back-end setting. We just need to flick it on for you. Once group pricing is active, this lets you set a single flat rate, so a standard cost that it's always going to cost the client, but it lets you set additionals for each person over the minimum. So maybe for just a standard 10 people, it's 5,000 no matter what, but if then they offer and say, oh, can I put in an extra 11th person? We say, sure, but that's $50 extra. So each new one you put in over that sort of minimum limit, we're going to keep upping the cost. That's the main purpose of this group pricing tool. So that's where we can set the pricing for our short courses. So we've seen now how to create finance codes, defining what certain amounts are, and how to set the pricing for your actual individual courses. Remembering that for a full qualification, like a Cert 3 or a diploma, that should be done at the qualification level, whereas short courses like a first aid or a white card, that should be set at the workshop types. Remember, of course, that workshop types let you set two different rates depending on whether it's general public student showing up for it, or if you're delivering maybe to a group under a corporate client. We're now going to move on and take a look at how to set up costs for things that aren't tuition. That's all we've been examining thus far. So I hope to see you there as we take a look at the additional items list. Welcome back. So far, we've been tracking the setup of our basic finance settings, putting in finance codes and course prices, but as mentioned, all the course prices we've looked at so far are related purely to tuition. It doesn't take into account other things such as material costs, admin fees, things that you may want to add on top of it. Any non-tuition items within aXcelerate should be entered as additional items within this items list. I want to make clear that this items list should only be for non-tuition items. The actual tuition cost should go against the courses, but for those extras, we can build as many as we want within here. So let's go there now. All right, as with the finance codes area, the system's picked up that we have no items at all in the system, thus it's asking for us to create our first one. The main things that we will strictly need are the item description and the item code. So I'm going to go ahead and add an extra item here of enrollment fee. So we just charge an additional cost for just enrolling into a course as well as the flat tuition. And I'm going to give that an item code in here. Just a quick reminder for anyone using some sort of finance integration with say MYOB or Xero, these will likely correlate to some sort of inventory you have in those systems. So you may need to use descriptions and codes that actually match that in order for the integration to work. Again, if you have any questions on that, please do consider the documentation or reach out to your onboarding consultant. As well as the description and the code, there is this optional step of setting the finance code. Like with everything you'll see, there's really no reason to leave this empty. Otherwise, the system will kind of struggle to know where that amount belongs for the item. So I'm going to drop this open and choose the admin fees finance code that we set up earlier. Below that, we then also have the default price, so literally how much this item normally costs. I'm going to go ahead and say it's 100. I'm going to leave the GST payable. Because this is not actually the tuition cost, it's an extra item we're putting on there, GST would actually apply to that. If this is a reflective of something that's maybe part of the accredited package, you may not be allowed to charge GST for it, you can simply untick that just fine. Below that, we have options for postage costs, displaying on the website. We aren't going to need any of that set up here today. We're going to stick with the key top fields of descriptions, the finance code, and the overall cost of the item. I'll now hit submit to add that into the system. And now it's sitting as part of the list, which we'll be able to now use in other areas when we're setting up invoices. Before we proceed, I'm going to create one more, add another item in here. And this one is going to be for a first aid kit. Again, setting our finance code and the default cost. We can say that's $20 normally. With that in place, I'll hit submit. And we create an extra item. And we could continue doing that. So we've now seen how to set up additional non-tuition items. Remember, if any of your actual tuition costs, those belong in either your qualifications or workshop types, depending on your individual setup. Any extras outside of that should be made part of the additional items list. We're now going to move on and looking at getting into the invoicing for those full qualifications. The first step in that will be ensuring that the classes that we'll be invoicing from are actually set up appropriately. So I hope to see you there as we get into that finance setup for classes. Welcome back to the lesson. We've been covering a bit so far, looking at our basic finance setup, putting in our seeds, finance codes, and setting prices for courses. We're now going to start getting towards actually raising some invoices there. But to facilitate that, we need to ensure that our classes are set up correctly for our full qualifications. As a general rule, you will find that within aXcelerate, it really wants to raise invoices from actual bits of training. Within accounting software, you may find that you raise an invoice in isolation for a person and mark what course it was for. Within aXcelerate, it actually wants to raise the invoice from the enrollment itself, be that in a class or a workshop. Because of that, we need to ensure that those enrollments, those instances are set up accordingly. So I'm going to go down here into our list of classes, like so. And we can see we've got a number of cohorts set up to enroll students into this Cert 3 in individual support. So I'm going to go into this example here, the 2022 intake, and we'll take a look at its individual finance settings to make sure it's going to be right to raise invoices. Once we're in here, I'm going to hit update like so. And we're really presented with a lot of the initial information. This has been set up before in prior demonstrations to show class setup. If you have any questions on reaching this point, I do recommend you go back and check out that lesson for the basics of classes themselves. Taking into account finance though, if we go down a bit further, we'll see that there are two fields in here, finance code and course fee. So as you can see, this field is not filled in. The reason for that is that previously when this class was created, no finance codes actually existed in the system, thus nothing was set against the Cert 3 qualification. To fill that in, we can manually apply it here, but any class we create after this point should have this already pre-filled, as we have now set course fees against the Cert 3 qualification. Below that, we have the course fee, and this is the default amount that students enrolled into this cohort, this February 2022 intake, will be charged, $5,000. We can see here that below that there's a grey section. That's showing you how much the cost is against the qualification. Right now that's matching. We can, however, just change this. We could say, actually, for this group, Feb's nice and early in the year, we want to give them a little bit of a discount. Say, no, this group just pays $4,000 instead. We can happily desync those. This is just a reminder to tell you what it normally would cost. As you can see, this option is unticked by default. It assumes that this tuition here is for an accredited course where you're not allowed to charge GST, thus it should not be included. If you're setting these up as perhaps non-accredited courses, perhaps you're running enterprise, you may need to turn this on to ensure GST is included, but as a default, it will not be. So with those two fields set, I'm going to hit update class at the bottom, and that should save the information there. Nice and done. So now this has been set up to have a default finance code and a fee. So when we enroll a student, they should inherit a lot of the information that we need to actually raise an invoice for them. So I'm going to go ahead and click back here. That should take me right to the class I just modified. And here we are. We already have some students enrolled into this, so we could go in and actually set up their finance, which had not been done previously, but I would like to firstly show you how it works for a brand new enrollment. That's the normal process when you're manually invoicing. You generally do that as you're putting them into the class. So let's take a look at that. To put a student in, I'm going to hit this enroll button up in here. As seen in previous lessons, we will search up the relevant contact of our choice. So I'm going to put in Andrew into this one. He can study that Cert 3, like so. With a contact then selected, we'll move ahead with this button down here. We're taken to the enrollment setup screen. This is just showing us his key dates he's been putting into, the units he'll be studying. For further information on this, I do recommend looking back at our previous lesson on class setup where it showed this enrollment process in more detail. Today, we're going to more or less skip past this to get to the finance side of things. I'm going to scroll on down here and click this enroll contact to proceed. We are. We're now being taken to the fees setup area. In previous lessons, we were skipping past this, but I'm going to focus on it now as this is where the finance is done. At this point, we're being asked to confirm the finance details for this specific student, only Andrew. As you can see, he is inheriting a lot of information from this class. The tuition finance code we set up and the course cost have flown into this individual enrollment. However, at this point, we can still override things. So although the majority of students in here might be paying $4,000, we could say for Andrew specifically, he could get a big discount of $2,000, like so. Furthermore, we could point him at a different finance code up here. So if you have maybe regional finance codes and this person's kind of coming from an unusual background, then maybe remit to change this to something a bit more relevant, and that can be done at this individual level. I'm going to leave it by the default for now, but I'm just highlighting that there so you can see that we can set costs at the entire qualification, set the pricing a little differently for individual classes, but even inside of that, you can make the finances very specific and tailored to each individual enrollment. Further down, you will see there are other sections here for the employer and other contribution. Right now, we're only focusing on this here, what the student is going to pay you for enrolling in this course. It is actually possible to divvy up the cost between different parties, for example, an employer or some sort of other contact. This could be maybe if the student is a minor, maybe they're being enrolled, but maybe their parent is paying for it. In that case, it may make sense to address the cost in the invoice to the parent instead. Getting into this, looking at the setup section and how to autofill this was something we'll look at in a later lesson in more advanced finance. For today, we'll keep our focus assuming that the student is just going to pay the full amount directly to us, so we'll be invoicing them. With this section set like so, I'm going to scroll down and we could actually go right to setting up the invoice for that student as well. But to give some context of what this is doing, I'm just going to leave it as View Enrollment Summary and hit Submit to confirm that cost and finance code. There we go. So the student's been successfully enrolled into the class. If you've looked at our previous lessons, this should be seeming familiar. As for the finances, you will find that they exist at the very bottom of these pages. So if I continue all the way down past the units and event list details, at the end, we will get this set up in here. So we can see that we have $4,000 worth of tuition fees, and that cost has been put against Andrew specifically, no other parties in this case. Of that amount, none of it's yet been invoiced, and therefore none of it's been paid. So we've just got that overall outstanding balance, and we'll see how that changes as we go forward. If we've made an error here at any point, maybe we just quickly enrolled them and then didn't change their price where we should have. We haven't raised an invoice, so we're pretty free. So you click this white button up here, and we're back at this screen where we can just change figures. So we can adjust that cost once again, maybe whack a 50 cent in there for fun, change the code, whatever we see fit. Once you've made your changes here, by hitting Submit at the bottom, it will just save that, and any changes will flow through to this finance area. So that's how to prepare a class for invoicing and how when you enroll a student to set up the individual costs within that. We're now going to move on and take a look at how to actually raise an invoice for that. So I hope to see you there in this next chapter. Welcome back. As you've just seen, we've gone ahead and we've set up a class with correct costs, and we have enrolled a student within that, this Andrew Denise fellow here. Upon enrolling him, we have gone ahead and ensured that he's gotten the correct finance details. So he's inherited a tuition fee of $4,000. That's what he owes for this course that he'll be paying for. And if we click this edit pen to look further in, we can see we've got a finance code here. So that tuition will be put against this finance or GL code here. Now that the student is actually enrolled in here, we can go ahead and raise an invoice in aXcelerate for him. This can be done manually with this blue button over here. So since we're happy with the cost, that's all looking correct, I'm going to give this a click here. This will then bring you to a screen where the system's more or less asking you what you want on the invoice. Up the top, we've got some details on what we're doing, who we're invoicing to, and we have the option to put in a purchase order number here. This may not be relevant for all of your courses or students, but that is where the option remains. If you forget to fill in the purchase order number here, fear not, you'll be able to put it in on the invoice that we'll see in a moment. Further down, the system's asking what amount we want on the invoice. Because we have not set this up with any advanced arrangements like a finance model or a payment plan, something like that, it's just a simple figure of 4,000, so it's more or less assuming it wants that full amount on the enrollment, which is what we'll do. If we open that up, we do have other options. We could, for example, do a part amount. So we could say only invoice for 2,000, we'll invoice for the remaining 2,000 at a later date, kind of like almost an ad hoc payment plan. If that's something you're going to routinely do, I would instead recommend probably going through and setting up actual payment plans to power that, but we'll be examining how all that works in a later lesson. As mentioned, I'm going to leave this as full remaining amount, like so, just a single line item on the invoice for a full 4,000 that the student will have to pay us for. Furthermore, we can bolt on additional items that are not related to the tuition fees. Remember that we made these initially in our items list, our additional items. With them in there, that means they should be easily selectable in this drop down like so. As you can see, we've got the enrollment fee and the first aid kit. So if I give this a click, it will automatically fill in that enrollment fee. All the information that we set up before in here has basically pre-filled, nice and easy. We can, of course, override this. We could say we just want Andrew to pay a bit more for that. We don't trust him there, so we're going to whack on our extra $100. System will happily accommodate that. Or we could just keep it as is, which I'll do here. With all of this selected, we can then hit this button here to actually create the invoice in aXcelerate. If you can't see a button here at this point, I recommend going back and checking your finance settings. You either likely have missed the finance seeds that we saw before, the invoice seed, or you may have neglected to set a finance code against the specific enrollment. If either of those aren't true, you simply will not get this button available. Since we've configured all that, that should be fine to use. I'm going to click Create Invoice to raise the draft of an invoice now. There we go. So we're now presented with this drafting setup screen. Right away, I would like to make clear to everyone that this is not what a student gets sent. This is just an interface to show you all the information together. The invoice document or email you send, we'll be able to sort of customize that to your needs. So don't worry too much if you're concerned about the format. This is just for your benefit. As you can see, this invoice has a lot going on. It's got the line items we had selected before, the enrollment fee of $4,000, the tuition fee of $4,000, and the smaller enrollment fee of $100 are two line items on the invoice like so. This invoice is currently in a draft state, so we're free to actually edit quite a lot of this. You can see that there's no invoice number issued, and we've got edit pens to change a lot of things. To give you context, I'd like to go back to the enrollment we raised this from briefly. So I'm going to go ahead and click this link here. That should take us right back to Andrew's Cert 3 enrollment. Here we are. We're back at the finance section of the Certificate 3 enrollment we put him in just before. So remembering finance lives at the bottom, we can see now that the 4,000 and the 100, before they had no invoice against them, now they do. This icon here is actually the same one invoice, and we can see here that we've now invoiced for $4,100. Nothing's been paid yet, so this remains at zero and the balance is there, but at least we've got the start of an invoice going. As you can see, we are raising the invoice from the enrollment itself. This is pretty critical, as this is how aXcelerate knows what students owe. We could theoretically take an invoice like this and make it in isolation, just put an invoice against Andrew, but if it's not connected to the course, the system won't actually know if they've paid for that specific course or not. So it is quite critical that your invoicing is done from actual enrollments rather than just create sort of a floating invoice in the system. Now, before we can really do anything with this invoice, say send it out to the student or record payments, we do need to more or less get it finalized. This green icon here, that's your hint this is a draft invoice, so it's not really ready to be used by any means. To get into it, we can simply click this icon. And we're back here at that drafting setup area. Before we finalize it, there are things that you may want to modify. As mentioned, maybe you've missed the purchase order number. As you can see, it's pretty empty in here. And additionally, notice that the due date here has pre-populated. Back in the original settings, we saw that there's a standard due date offset. So this has set itself to be 30 days from the date the invoice was created, as we can see in here. We may want that different. Maybe we want Andrew paying a little earlier. So I can hit this edit pen and adjust these to my heart's content. So I could pull this back and say, actually, could you please pay this by the 20th instead of the March or what have you, and we could put in a purchase order number if we'd forgotten to before. Happy with the changes? I'm going to hit tick to confirm those, and now that due date has been changed accordingly. We can do the same for other areas. For example, this bill to address is pretty blank since Andrew didn't have an actual address put in. We can hit this edit pen and fill in things as we need. This can be useful if, say, your student maybe has one sort of residential address but wants the invoice sent to something completely different. Maybe you want to just change where the invoice is going to, even though the student's residence needs to be recorded for event reasons. I'm not going to alter these today. I'm just going to hit the X button there to cancel out of that. You can also edit these line items if necessary. So if I hit the edit pen over here, We could, for example, change this finance code to go, oops, actually the enrollment fee should be against a different finance code. I made a mistake there. So keep that in mind. You can also adjust the price like so. A word of warning though, changing the cost here will not always alter the actual cost of the course. It will normally just change what the person is being invoiced. We have said that this course is $4,000. That's what the student needs to pay. If we change this line item, that can lead to the effect of where the student still owes $4,000, but the invoice has only got $2,000 on it. So they would have an additional $2,000 outstanding that's not being invoiced for. If you're in that situation, I'm gonna hit the red X here to cancel my changes. This icon on the far right would actually remove the line item. It would strike the 4,000 from the list. So I wanna keep it there, like so. If you've made a mistake, you've raised an invoice for like a wrong amount or some details are looking severely off, while it's still in this draft state, you can quite simply just delete it. You can just scrub it out and say, okay, this needs to be redone. That will just completely delete it from the system. You can then go back to the enrollment, adjust the details, and then raise a new draft invoice with the more correct information. While we're on this middle table here, I also point out that there are further fields that you can't initially see. If you hit this little gear on the right here, you can populate those. So for example, I want to see the item code of each item on there, or potentially the domain if I've been using them. So just keep these in mind, especially if you are looking to use an external finance accounts integration. You may need to have visibility on these columns to make sure the exports work. I'm going to click off that, just leave those columns like so. And that's pretty much it as far as editing the invoice. But as mentioned before we're ready to record payments, send this out, we need to get this invoice out of its draft state. The main way to do that is we need to issue a number for the invoice. This is the big thing that's holding it back. And you can see in the bottom left, I can tick this box here and do so. A word of advice, this is often sufficient as is, but if you have indeed finalized an invoice, if it's ready to go and you don't really expect to change it, we generally recommend also finalizing your invoice. So that's hidden under this more options down in here. Clicking that open will let you tick that box. A finalized invoice cannot really be edited unless it's deliberately unlocked by someone with higher user permissions. This is especially important if you are using an integration, as if you create an invoice in our system and export it to external software, if you change the invoice in aXcelerate, we can't really export the changes. So if you've exported it across to one area and you change the invoice in aXcelerate, that desynchronizes the data quite rapidly. So to prevent that from being a possibility, finalizing your invoices can usually safeguard against that. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to hit save. And now the invoice is all locked down and it has an invoice number. Note that it's got the number of INV001. That's pulling from the seed, padding, and prefix that we touched on earlier. Since this is locked down, I've lost the ability to edit a lot of these things. So you'll see I can't really click or do anything here. At this point, if we've made a mistake with it, we can only have really two options there. One is you could unlock the invoice and adjust it afterwards. Again, if you've already exported the invoice out of aXcelerate, that's generally not a good idea because then that will desynchronize it. So in those cases, it's often safer to void the invoice. That will keep the invoice in aXcelerate, but more or less marks it as not relevant anymore. It says don't try and track it for payments, don't show it up in reports normally. It's the record is kept, but it's not treated as active anymore. When you void it, you'll then be able to raise a new fresh invoice with the correct details. Now that we have finalized our invoice, that we've given it a number, I'd like to return back to the enrollment that we created this invoice from in here. And you can see now that where this was green before, it's now gone red and it actually has a number against it. A red icon like this means that it is a raised invoice, it's got a number, but it has unpaid balance. We haven't recorded any payments against this, that's why it's showing as red. Once we do record payments, when it's fully paid, we should see this change to black. So this offers a quick way for you to tell when things are being paid off in aXcelerate. You can come into a student's enrollment to get details of what they're studying and their units, and stashed at the very bottom, you can quickly assess, oh, have they been paying for their course? I can tell from this red icon that there's something outstanding in there. So that's the process of raising invoices for class enrollments. As we've seen, you first generally need to prepare the class to ensure it has the right information. That way, when a student is enrolled, they will, by default, inherit the right costs and finance codes against their enrollment. Once that is all in place, you can use this manual invoice button to actually produce the invoice, adjust it around in a draft state. Then, when ready, you can go into the invoice, finalize it, and issue the number, readying it to either be sent out of the system or to record payments against it. We're now going to move on and look at the invoicing process for the short courses, the workshops. We haven't really touched those other than looking at the pricing. So I hope to catch you around for that. Once we've completed our invoice raising processes, we'll then be moving on to looking at the how to record payments and also send these invoices out to your students too. So I hope to catch you there. Welcome back. So far, we've been looking at setting up our classes and invoicing for enrollments into full qualifications, how we raise invoices for those. We're now going to move on and look at how to set up and manage invoices for our short courses. But to really get into that, we first need to make sure that our instances are going to have the correct information. Much like how before we raised an invoice for Andrew in his Cert 3, we had to ensure that the class itself was set up. We need to make sure that our workshop types and our workshop instances have that correct information. Otherwise, when we book students in there, the system won't know what we should really be charging them. The first thing I would like to address is the additional items. So we've seen that when we enrolled Andrew, we had the $4,000 tuition against his entire enrollment. If I go into here like so, down at the very bottom, $4,000, and then also $100 of additional enrollment fee, a non-tuition item. To get those additional items for more short course enrollments, the workshops, we need to ensure that that's firstly actually set against the type level. So I'm going to click into here now and into that first aid CPR. Scrolling down the page, you'll see here where there's public booking extra items. As we looked at before with the pricing, most of the tuition is handled in these fields up in here. But for additional things, like say if I want to bolt on a first aid kit, to have that option, I need to change this and put in, say, first aid kit like so. When you do this, you will be provided a further refinement. You can actually say whether it's required. So we can say that, oh, you need to buy this. So everyone who books in on a public course would pay $50 and necessarily is also paying $20 for their first aid kit. Or we could make it optional with a default option. So we could say, yeah, it's optional, you don't have to buy it, but normally you would want to, so we'll have it on. Or you could say, no, most students will not purchase the first aid kit, but we might want to tack it on if they request it. I'm going to leave it as optional yes in here, so we can see that effect as it comes through. With that set, I'm going to hit submit down below to save the type. So keep that in mind if you are charging non-tuition items with your short courses. Let's move on now to actually setting up an instance with the right pricing so that students who go into it will have the correct sort of invoices automatically pre-filled. To do that, I'm going to go here and we'll just be creating a brand new workshop. Up the top, I'm going to go ahead and choose the relevant type. We've only got the one, that makes that nice and easy. Excellent. And in this case, we're going to look firstly at the setup of public workshops. Remember that this coordination type does have direct implications for invoicing. In-house would normally be used if you're, say, running a corporate course with a direct client. So rather than each student paying their own way, you would just have a client paying for kind of everyone within there, more of a mass group booking. Whereas a public is where each person's coming to their own accord, they're each invoiced differently. So we'll examine how that works first. With that then selected, I'm going to hit the submit button in here. There we go. And now we have to set up the workshop like we have looked at in previous sessions. A lot of this will remain the same, of choosing trainers, ensuring the units are selected. But in today, I want to focus a bit further down at the specific pricing fields. You can see here, we have a cost per learner field. That is pulled through from the workshop type setup. Remember we set a cost per participant of $50. That's what's showing up in here. We can, of course, override this if we so want. So we could say, oh, this is a session happening maybe later in the month, and on that day, it's going to be a little cheaper for everyone, or conversely, more expensive. We can override it at this individual level. Alternatively, we can just leave it as the standard rate there. No need to modify it if desired. Again, this assumes that this is probably going to be for accredited training, thus it's assuming that you should not be charging GST for that fee. Again, if you run non-accredited courses, any enterprise level things, you may want to untick that so that GST becomes inclusive of that cost. First aid's an accredited course though, so I'm going to leave that ticked there. And then I'm going to go here and choose the relevant finance code. Reminder, this is fairly important. With no finance code set, you'll find it almost impossible to actually raise an invoice, so do ensure that this is being selected while you're verifying the cost of the course. I'm now going to go through and just finish making up this workshop, filling in the other fields. If you want a review of this area and how to create workshop instances, I do recommend checking back on our previous lesson on the topic. All right, so I've now created this workshop instance. So we have the first aid running specifically on the 28th of February, and we can see in here, the price per learner is $50 as we set on the previous screen. If we needed to, no one's been enrolled into this yet down the bottom, so do keep in mind we can update this over on the top left, and we can go down and adjust the fee or the finance code if necessary before we get anyone in there. With this set, we should be right to now start putting students in there and actually seeing how the invoices are raised for these short courses. So I hope to see you in a moment. Hey again. We're about to look at raising an invoice for a public workshop booking. So far, we've set up this CPR course running on the 28th to have a standard price. It should be costing $50 per learner who books into this. Like back with class enrollments, keep in mind that aXcelerate wants to generate the invoice against the booking or enrollment. We're going to be doing it as we put them in the course. We're not going to raise the invoice separately in some other area. So to examine that, let's go ahead and put someone in with this book learners button down in here. Giving that a click, I'm going to search up an existing contact in aXcelerate. Jane will do just fine. And upon clicking the enroll button, we'll move ahead with the booking. As seen in previous sessions, we're deciding what we're putting them into. This course, these units of competency, we can give her a study reason. If you need any further detail on this booking process, I recommend checking back on the previous lesson with workshop enrollments. Further down, I will point out this field here though, this requested by. With public bookings, this is generally what the system will try and address the invoice to. Now, it's assuming that Jane is going to pay her own way. She's the one enrolling, thus she is the one who's going to pay for it. If desired, you can manually override that to someone else. So perhaps an organization is paying on Jane's behalf. Maybe she's a minor student and a parent's paying for her. You can manually adjust that requested by to any other contact in aXcelerate so that although the invoice will be for Jane's course, it will be addressed to someone else entirely. I'm going to leave it by the default for now and proceed ahead. So I'm going to hit this continue button here to proceed with the booking. Okay. And now we're at the finance setup area. This is where the system's drawing in all the previous work we've done with the workshop type and the instance to list out the pricing. As you can see, the workshop price, we set it as $50 and that's what's pulling through here. Like with class enrollments, we can manually override at this level. We could say specifically for Jane, she is going to pay $30. It's just going to be cheaper for her. But we'll leave it as the default in today's example. In here, we have the additional items. We've set that at the workshop type level. We've said first aid kit is an optional extra, so you can pay $20 to give it. It was made optional on default, yes, so by default it's making her have it, but we can deselect to say, no, she's not interested, she just doesn't want to bother paying for that one. But in this case, leave it on, thus bringing the total cost to $70. When we raise the invoice, we should actually see two different line items, the tuition fee of $50 and this extra line item for the first aid kit of $20. Below that, we have the invoicing options. You can see here, you can just skip this with a regular booking, but by default, the system does want to pretty much immediately raise an invoice. Furthermore, it also wants to issue the number right away as well. The reason this happens is because with short courses, they're generally quite rapid fire, generally the costs aren't too excessive, so there's a bias towards just getting that invoice out as quickly as possible. Unlike with classes, where it's a bit more steady pace because it might be quite a large course, maybe it needs to be broken up into installments. But here, we're pretty fine to just rapid fire it. You can see down here, the invoice to is actually being addressed to Tracy Matters. Now, we didn't change that requested by. We didn't put Tracy in there. We said that, oh, well, it should be Jane paying for it. The reason that's flowing through at this stage is if we take a look at Jane themselves, I'm going to go to search contacts in a separate tab up in here. And we'll just search up Mrs. Doe. And we can click through to her name like so. The reason that's occurring is that Jane is linked to this organization of Movie World, like so. And if we click through on that, we can see that the payer contact has been set up as Tracy. So under this arrangement, it means that anyone who's under the organization of Movie World, if they're booked into a course, the default person who's going to get the invoice addressed to them is actually going to be Tracy rather than that individual person. So this could be good or bad depending on your setup. If you have that arrangement where you have companies regularly booking people just into public courses, so they don't get workshops made specifically for them, they just drop students into public courses here and there. By linking those people to an organization and setting a payer contact, that can very easily help divert those invoices to that company rather than each individual. If the students still pay on their behalf, you may want to actually make sure there is no payer contact. So this system by default will address the invoice to, say, Jane instead of up all the way to Tracy. Returning back to this area here, you can, of course, override this. So I've got Tracy listed here, but I can say, no, I really do want to send the invoice to Jane. So I'm going to click that there. It shoves her in place like so. If you do not have any payer contacts set, it will then just simply not have this option at all. It'll just say Jane, unless, of course, you've changed the requested by that we saw earlier. So we've now set up what we want on the ultimate invoice. We have the line item for the tuition, the line item for anything extra as well, and we've decided who's getting the invoice. I'm going to go ahead and let it raise an invoice number on its own. That's perfectly fine, and hit confirm price to proceed. We have now completed the booking into the public workshop while simultaneously raising an invoice. We can see up here the workshop Jane is now in, as well as the invoice that was created. Note, unlike the class enrollments, this isn't green, it's already red and got a number. So it's pretty much ready to go and send out to a student or potentially record a payment against it. Below that, we do have options for sending that out of the system as well, but we'll be addressing sending invoices a bit later on. For now, I'd like to return back to the workshop that we started this from. And we can see if we scroll further down, the student has been booked in, and now there's an invoice bolted against her booking there. Like with the class enrollments, remember red refers to an invoice that has outstanding balance. If it was black, it would be fully paid. So we can kind of at a glance tell if someone's paid for their booking or not, just from this little icon. If this is green, that means the invoice is in a draft state, and that means you would have probably skipped that invoice number step. If that's the case, remember that you will need to go into the invoice by clicking it, and then clicking the issue number down below. But you can see in this example, that isn't necessary. It's already generated the number over here. As a further point, remember, again, if you guys are using any sort of finance integrations or plan to, it may be necessary to go through and ensure that these invoices are finalized as well, just to avoid any data desyncs if you begin exporting your invoices. So I'm going to go ahead and finalize that here. Excellent. To get back to the workshop, you can, of course, just click this blue text that should drag you back to the booking. This points you into the booking itself, so this is giving the details very specifically to Jane here. If we want to get back up to the overall level, I can click View Workshop in here, and that pulls me back to this screen where we were just before. So that's how to raise an invoice for a public workshop booking. As we've seen, it's a little more streamlined than doing it for a class. You're normally just putting in the booking, confirming the price, who the invoice is going to, any extra costs, finalizing the booking, and then you should get an effect very much like this here. We're now going to move on and look at a slightly different arrangement, which is more about in-house invoicing. So those cases where the entire course would be for a specific client or corporate contact, the individual students would be invoiced, and you would send a lump sum to that person. We'll examine that in a moment. Hope to catch you there. Hello once again. We've taken a quick look at raising invoices manually for public workshop bookings, just charging at a per person cost. We're now going to look at a different workshop setup where we're charging to a corporate client, just one invoice to a designated client contact for all the participants inside of it. To do this, we'll actually need to create yet another workshop instance, one that has a in-house coordination rather than a public one. So like before, we're going to go to add new workshop up here, and we're going to choose our type, and we're going to leave the coordination as in-house rather than public from before. Upon hitting submit, we'll proceed through. And the setup here, again, will be quite similar to other workshop arrangements, but with some slight key differences. First and foremost, we'll need to set a client contact up in here. Within the in-house arrangement, this is effectively the person who is going to be sent the invoice. So this may be an actual designated person, or it may be like an accounts department for the sort of larger organizations. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and just set it as aXcelerate over here. There we go. So although this workshop might have a ton of different people booked into it, the overall invoice will just simply be addressed to this one person. A lot of the other setup remains the same in terms of trainers, locations, units, all of that information. Again, I would recommend checking the lesson on workshop creation and bookings to get detail on that. I'm going to head down and focus more on the relevant aspects for the fees in this course. For in-house arrangements, you'll probably need to pay careful attention to this in here. So we have the minimum and maximum that defines the overall bounds of the workshop, but we can also set an expected number. This exists so that we can basically indicate what we're charging them for in advance. You may want to invoice a corporate client before you've actually gotten any bookings. Maybe said, oh, can you set up a course for me on later in the month? I'm expecting like 10 people to show up for that. Just send me the invoice in advance. I'll pay it off then. I'll tell you who's enrolling into it later on. So that would let you put in a 10 there to reflect their needs as such. The actual fees themselves are handled further down, but before we do that, we do need to make sure again that we're setting a finance code for the tuition. So while checking these numbers, also make sure that this is being filled in too. I'm going to put course fees like such. The pricing appears down in this section in here. As mentioned before, we have the in-house rate that's pulled through from our workshop type. So this is the flat fee that client will have to pay no matter what. Doesn't matter how many students show up, that's just what they're paying. It's pulled in 5,000 as a default, but as with a lot of other finance things we've seen today, we could change it for this one specific session. We could say, oh, the one that is running on, say, in 1st of March, that's when it's happening, 5 hours. You have to pay 5,000 for that. That seems a bit too much. Let's pull that back to say 3,000, lowering that standard cost. This also has group pricing turned on. Again, if you're looking to use this and can't see it, just get in touch with our support team. They'll be able to switch on the settings for you to gain access to this feature. Group pricing is a little different, where it will still charge this single flat in-house rate, but it will let you also add additional costs for people who exceed the minimum. So up the very top here, we could say, oh, the minimum is actually 10 people. So we don't even run this course unless there's at least 10 people booked into it. So from 1 to 9 to 10 people, you have to pay 3,000 no matter what. However, for each person over that minimum, let's say you book an 11th individual, we could say, actually, no, at that point, you've got to give us just an extra $50 to accommodate the extra person. So this here, we'll run a calculation based on these numbers up top. If you want to have an in-house workshop like this that has a purely per participant rate, so each person costs $50, that's it, that's how you want to charge it. The way you would configure that is to set this here as say $50 if it's $50 per person, and up top, we would set the minimum as 1. Under this arrangement, it means that here, the first person is $50 inherently, necessarily. Then for each person over the minimum, which is 1, so there'd be the second person, they'd be $50. And the third person will be another 50, and so on and so forth. So although it was an in-house workshop, it's actually using a per participant rate under this model. To keep things simple for all involved, I'm not going to use group pricing for today. I'm just going to respect that original, simple, flat cost, 5,000. We're just going to say, it doesn't matter if you book 9 or 20 people, I don't really care. That's what you're going to pay as our corporate client. While we're here, we can also bolt on a purchase order number that may be quite relevant for some of your corporate clients. So feel free to enter that here. Like we've seen earlier, if you forget to, it's not the end of the world. You can drop that in when we're actually raising the invoice. I'm now going to go through and finish up the rest of this workshop, put in some proper dates and other descriptors. So give me a moment and I'll finish that up for you. Okay, so I finished creating the workshop now. We've got a CPR course running on the 1st of March, currently in-house, and we can see here the client contact that was set is stashed like so. And so that means although we'll be booking potentially a bunch of different people in here, ultimately the invoice for this in-house rate will be addressed to our client, not any one individual student. To continue on, we'll need to book a couple of students into this course. Remember, for an in-house workshop, that is done using this book learners option. And this brings up this booking table. So as with in-house workshops, you may be getting people that you've never seen before. They're with that company that haven't been put into aXcelerate. This form will create those contacts for you and put them into the course. If you need a refresher on this feature, I recommend you check back on our previous session on the workshop usage. That includes the full running gamut on how to use this particular form. I'm going to go through and make sure this is all filled out with the event miss details and the relevant duplicate detection as well. So let me chuck in a couple of names there, and then I'll show you how you can then produce the relevant invoice. All right, so I've gone ahead and ensured there are some students in this workshop. We can see them down below, 2 people there. And unlike with the public workshop that we saw earlier, notice this invoice section adds this not required set. That's because we don't want to raise a different individual invoice for each person. We just want one bulk invoice to be addressed to our client contact up in here. So there's no need for us to really put any invoicing in there. And in fact, you should be able to raise an invoice even before you get any students in. You can invoice in advance for in-house, as mentioned earlier. To do so, we need to address this section here, this invoices bit. This refers to the invoices specifically for Alex, of which there are none, but we can actually click this gray box and raise the invoice for this course. By doing that, it brings up this area here. This is letting you know what it is going to put on the invoice, and you can see there is a single simple line item for $5,000 there. So that's just the flat rate we set. It's just $5,000 regardless of how many people are booked in there, and that's what will appear. You may want to put in some additional costs, extra line items that, outside of the tuition fees. To do that, you can go back and avoid this. You don't have to continue raising the invoice like so. You should be able to put in extra items outside the tuition for in-house via this extra billable items section down in here. By clicking this plus button like so, we can drop in extra line items that are non-tuition. This can pull from the additional items list that we set up earlier. I can get an enrollment fee or a first aid kit, for example, like so. And by selecting that, it will handily pre-fill all this in. Keep in mind, you do not have to use this gray section. You can type this in directly, but if it's something that's already kind of pre-baked, like a first aid kit has some standardization to it, it may definitely be easier to use this list pulling from your additional items list. Once that's in here, we'll see details of, what it is, when it should be charged, the trainer there, and of course the finance code. Note down in here, we then also set exactly what the client is being charged. So we could say, okay, it's a quantity of maybe just 1 per item, $20 there, and we could say, oh, they're going to be 2 first aid kits, or maybe they're going to get 5, maybe they're big spenders there. We could also instead perhaps set it by hours or duration of the course. It's up to you. You have some flexibility in here. I'm just going to keep it simple and say there are 2 students, so they're going to buy 2 first aid kits, $21 per item. You can also link it really directly to the number of learners. Just bear in mind, this will pull in the expected number of participants. So remember that there are only 2 people currently booked in here, but we expect 10 people in total to show up. Thus, it's going to draw from that. That's why it's jumping up to 10. For that reason, I'm going to untick this and leave it as 2 to reflect the actual number of booked people rather than the expected amount. GST is going to apply for this as it is in tuition, and then upon hitting submit like so, it has now added that extra item to our workshop. We can see here. With this in place and our in-house costing up here, it now means if we generate another invoice like so, it has combined both of them there. So we have that standard line that we set earlier, and also the 2 first aid kits that we put in our extra billable items. Note this one's got a little bit extra because the GST and the tax is flowing in there. Thus, our total is slightly higher than just the 4,000 from before. When you're happy with this view and you're ready to actually raise the invoice as we've done in other areas, we need to tick this box down like so. The reason we have this is just a little bit of security. With these in-house courses, they can be quite expensive. Often clients may buy fairly large courses. So we just put this in place so you don't accidentally raise an invoice for like 10 grand without checking the amounts. Lastly, note that you can adjust who it's being invoiced to at this rate. Like we've seen, the default behavior is to just choose that client contact that we set. That's generally the purpose of having the client contact there. With that in place, I'm going to go create new invoice. And that will produce a draft invoice that we've seen elsewhere. So it's now drawn in everything we had from before. It's got the information here on the number of learners that we're expecting there. Notice that it's 10, again, drawing from that expected amount, and the 2 first aid kits that were bolted on as an extra line item. Even though there are 2 different students in here, the invoice as a whole is being addressed to our client contact up in there. To make use of this, like everything else, you will at the very least need to issue an invoice number for this, so we can potentially send this, record payments, and under the more options, you would generally want to finalize it to, especially if you're planning to export this to external software. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And now if we click on this blue text to return back to the in-house workshop, we can see that the invoice is sitting pretty up in here. So unlike with public bookings, where the invoice is put against each individual participant, paying their own way or getting paid on behalf of, this is a much simpler arrangement where it's everyone sort of lumped together, one big invoice for our client contact. So that's how to raise invoices for the in-house workshops for your corporate delivery. We've now covered invoicing in all the main areas of aXcelerate. We've seen class enrollments, so for full qualifications, and the 2 different ways of invoicing for workshops or short courses, either for public participants or in-house participants. We're now going to move on into the realm of actually sending the invoices out of aXcelerate now that you've raised some. So I hope to see you there as we go through the different sending options available to you. Hey again. We've looked at raising a number of invoices thus far in the lesson, and we're now going to move on to how to actually fire those out of the system and how to send it. The simplest way to do so is to actually go into an invoice itself. Now we are on our in-house workshop here, so we can actually just click into this icon or number like so, and we'll come back to this invoice sort of setup area we looked at before. As a reminder, remember that what we're seeing here, this is not what the invoice actually looks like to the learners or clients. So it is just an interface so you can see all the information together. To get to sending, we need to make use of this option in here, the little send icon like so. This here is going to ask that you then pick a template. So it's important to keep in mind that all this sending behavior, we make use heavily of templates to govern the format of that. If you're unsure about how to format or what these are for, I do recommend looking back at our previous lesson on the topic to get the full detail on that. With that assumption in mind though, we'll go ahead and we'll choose a relevant template. You can see that it's pulling in a nice default one for us, a workshop tax invoice receipt. We could choose a different one of our choice there. We've got a few available, but I'll stick with this. This is probably going to work fine for our purposes. This template we're selecting here is what the invoice format should look like. So when we hit submit, we'll get a preview of that. Here we go. And we can see the template is pulling through a lot of the information configured from the invoice setup earlier. We've got who it's addressed to up in the top left. We've got the key dates listed down here. We've got an order number field. We've forgotten to put in the purchase order number, so that's empty. We could go back and rectify that if we want. And further down, we've got all the line items calculating up here. So this is an example of a template that's configured to pull in invoice information accordingly. You can also add additional things to your templates, such as putting in a link where people can pay via credit card. That requires the setup of a suitable payment gateway in aXcelerate. So if you want that kind of option, I do recommend checking out the documentation in our help guides on payment gateways to see if that's going to work for you. Once you're happy with the look of the invoice in here, as it is the template, presumably if you need to edit the template, you can certainly do so. But once you're satisfied with that, to actually fire it out of the system, you'll need to proceed to this email step. Here is the manual setup area. If you've checked out our templates lesson, this may look somewhat familiar, but you can see here we've got all the standard things such as the subject of the email. So we could change this manually for upcoming course, something to that effect. We've got the addressee in this box here. This is our client contact. That's exactly who we want. And we also have option to CC in additional people. Maybe there's someone besides the client contact, maybe their accounts department who needs to see. We can, of course, just type in whatever we want, like so. Now, most critically, do keep in mind that with invoices in particular, you aren't able to just send them as an email. The system by default will be trying to convert them into PDFs. It's just a bit more secure than having an HTML email with invoice info. So it will be an actual document. And you can see down in here, it's already putting itself as that attachment, invoice number 3.pdf. Because of this, it means we will actually need a second template. So for invoice sending, you need 2 templates. One for the format of the invoice itself, and another to act as the body text of what you're actually sending out of the system, like the email itself. That's what needs to be plugged into this email content in here. I believe if I type in invoice, we've got a pre-built example here, invoice email body. And this can be drastically simple. It could be very much, dear such and such, please find attached your invoice. Then all the detail on the fees and the course would be on the invoice PDF itself that we saw on the previous screen. With all that selected, and you're happy with the setup there, to actually fire it out of the system, we would need to hit the send button down here. Quick reminder, we are in staging today. Emails do work when you send them out of the staging environment. So if you are practicing your finance setup, if you're testing the sending, make sure you're only sending them internally to either yourself or other staff. If you send an invoice to a student or client, they will actually get that, and they probably won't know that it's just a test unless you've told them in advance. I'm confident we've got Alex's inbox nice and secure here, so no dramas with that. I'm going to hit send to proceed. And that has successfully sent out of the system. Remember that whenever you fire a template out from aXcelerate, it will log that behavior against the person who was meant to receive it. This means I can click back to Alex over here, get to their contact profile, and we should be able to see down below this note has automatically logged itself, recording that we have fired off the invoice to them. We can check out the email, so see the body text they got. As you can see, pretty basic example text there. Whereas what would be attached to that email is recorded in the invoice, like so. If I give this a click, it takes us through to here, so we can actually see all the details in aXcelerate. If you want to know what the actual document looked like, so the file they received, the PDF, that would be in this little paper clip down like so. If I click that open, we can see that it's all the same data, but assembled into this template format that we previewed earlier. Again, if you have any questions on formatting your templates for a suitable look, I do recommend either checking out the previous lesson or chatting with your onboarding consultant for more finer points on how to format these. I'll also point out that it is possible to automate the sending of these to some extent. Automating the raising of invoices is somewhat more difficult. There's some dependencies there, but sending them out can be done a fair bit more easily. I recommend checking out our webinars on the workflow automation engine later on in an implementation to see how that could be achieved. Early on, my recommendation is to focus on just ensuring that your raising process is in place and you have the suitable templates. That will help inform any automations you may later want to look at, assuming you're a Turbo client with access to that engine. So that's how to send invoices from aXcelerate. Just to recap, easiest method is to simply find the invoice that you're after, and then from there, you can use the send option against it to fire it away. Since invoices are being raised against the actual courses, often it's easiest to just search for the workshop, the class, or the student that you're after, go to that enrollment, and then you should be able to locate the invoice that you need. So for example, to relate it back to class enrollments, I could go to Andrew, go into this intake, this cohort we put him into, and down the very bottom, we have an invoice. And by clicking through onto there, we again will get access to that send option like we just did for that in-house send out. Okay, we're now going to proceed on to actually how you record payments against the invoices. Normally after you've sent them out, people will probably be paying them, and you should be reflecting that in aXcelerate so it has some understanding of things being paid off. So I hope to see you sticking around as we examine that payment recording process. Welcome back. So we've gone through our processes of raising invoices and sending them out to people. But as mentioned, you'll then probably want to start making sure that payments are being recorded. People are going to pay for their courses. And for aXcelerate to know that's happening, we need to make sure those are recorded in our system. To be clear, remember that aXcelerate is primarily invoice generation software. It is not accounting software, thus if you record a payment in our system, it's not actually doing anything. It's not moving money anywhere. No transaction is really occurring with that. Instead, recording a payment is more like just reconciling, just flagging like, yes, that transaction has been processed already, and just letting you know that invoice is now all cleared. Keeping that in mind, to record a payment manually, you first need to navigate to an invoice like the one we have here. To recap, the way I did that is I just went to the student I was after. In this case, it was Mr. Andrew Denise. And upon clicking into his enrollment there that the invoice is attached to, we were able to go to the very bottom of the page where the finance lives and just click through onto it. Once you're at a screen like this, if the invoice is out of a draft state, if it actually has an invoice number, you'll be given access to record payments against that particular invoice. We've got a few options here. The first one up top, record payment, that's very much that just manual reconciliation I described there. So you have a payment transacted through some external software, what have you. Once that happens, you can click this and you can record the payment in aXcelerate to say that's happened. This one down here, this process credit card payment, is a little bit different. If you're using a payment gateway such as eWay, that will actually bring up that interface and it will do two actions. It will let you actually process the transaction through eWay, and then it will also apply that payment to the invoice immediately. In that case, it's kind of a, all in one action. Just bear in mind that eWay is the one actually doing the transaction and the payment being applied is just a note that that's occurred. If the payment has been done through some external system like an FBOS machine, or it's done in accounting software like Xero and you don't have an integration, you'll need to be clicking record payment to manually set that here. Once I've clicked this button, we then can decide the method that we wish to do. So I can do check, FBOS, what have you. And then we can also decide what amount it is. This invoice doesn't have any sort of breakdown or what have you, it's just a single flat 4,100, so it kind of assumes that's what's going to be paid off. You can actually record partial payments by just manually pulling that down. So if you invoice a student and they don't actually pay all the way, you can just click that option and produce it like I have done here. We'll keep it at the full amount in this point. There we go. And then we can also put in a receipt number, entirely optional, and description. May be useful if you want to note what certain transactions are, maybe relate them back to whatever external platform you're using to actually manage those accounts. If I hit save payment there, it will then apply that over like so. And you'll see now the invoice is marking itself as paid. We did one single payment for the full amount, 4,100. Thus, it's now understanding this is cleared off. If I click back to the enrollment itself with this blue text over here, we can see now the invoice has that black coloration. This indicates that it is fully paid. There is no outstanding balance. Everything is paid off. Excellent. If you want a bit more detail on what's happened with that, you can actually click back into the invoice even though it's paid. And you can go into here and use this show applied amounts. That will let you check what's been previously done. And we can see here, we've got the date and the entry there. So someone's recorded that we received money from Andrew to the tune of 4,100. If we click this magnifying glass, we can even get further detail like so. We can see at this point, the payment method was also via FPOS. This process is pretty much the same for any invoice you can find in the system. So to relate it back to the short courses, let's say we want to look up a student who's enrolled in that. I'm going to go to Jane, who was put into a public short course workshop. There, she was put in the first aid, CPR, PW, public coordination. If I click through onto that, we're now in that specific workshop session, and we can see we had her invoice stashed down below. Currently red, unpaid. By clicking this icon, we can now see we have the same invoice set up and the process is identical. I can go here and do record payment. I could change the date of this, say it's actually been paid as of yesterday, and I could say she just gave cash in hand. I could also pull that down. I'll show you what that's like. Let's say she gave us 30 bucks in hand and she's still outstanding. If I hit save payment on that, you can see the balance has dropped accordingly. It was at 70, it's now down to 40. And if we go to show applied amounts, it will show us that payment there. So we've got the history of it. Do note, however, if we return back to her enrollment, her booking, the invoice remains in that red state. So that's there to warn us like, yeah, there's been a payment, but there's still an outstanding amount. She's not fully paid from the course. So at these high level views, you can use this to quickly assess who's paid what. But if you want more detail and thinking, okay, but what have they paid thus far? You can click into an invoice, go to show applied amounts against the payment list, and then see what's been coming through at this point. So that's how to record payments against your invoices in aXcelerate. As a recap, remember that this is more or less a reconciliation process. Doing this isn't actually moving money anywhere, but by doing so, we do get visibility on whether or not certain courses are being paid off, and this will also feed into the aXcelerate report builder later on if you're interested in those sort of finance reports. We're now going to move on and look at sort of the opposite case of processing a refund. So if you have to give money back to a student, which will be facilitated via credit notes. So I'll see you in a moment as we examine the refund process. Hi again. We've looked at how to record payments against invoices, those that we've been raising during the session thus far. We're now going to sort of head towards our final chapter looking at processing refunds. Those cases where maybe you've taken money in, but then perhaps there's been a cancellation, a dispute, and now you've got to pay money out. You can reflect that flow of transaction, that refund process in aXcelerate. We'll be doing that via credit notes. So far, we have looked at producing invoices for courses and how that reflects the cost of what students owe us. A credit note is, as mentioned way early on, a kind of reverse situation. It's a note saying what you owe the student back. To create one of these, to manage a refund, we generally need to manage to go to a paid invoice. In this case, we have a fully paid invoice against the student Andrew. I'm going to go in here, head inside his enrollment where the invoice is really attached to, and down the very bottom in his finance, we can see this here. So to process a refund, we're looking at this here saying, oh, okay, he's paid us $4,100, but now he wants to have that money back. He's actually going to drop out of this entirely. We can go into the invoice and we can see here it's being paid. Remember that you can use show applied amounts to track the history of that as well. To manage the refund, we need to go ahead and hover over this more option down here and firstly create the credit note to let the system know that we are going to be giving money out at some point. Upon doing so, it will then ask what we want to include on that credit note. By default, everything will be listed in there. If we so want, we could actually deselect things to say, yeah, we'll refund you for the course fees, but that enrollment fee we're keeping. We don't want to refund you there. That was just part of signing up at all. In this example, I'll just include everything for simplicity's sake, but keep in mind you don't have to put every line item if you don't want to. Upon selecting that, we can also put in a note here, by the way, if you want to note why it's happening internally, we could say, didn't want to proceed. But then I'll go ahead and actually create the credit note. Here it's just giving us a final warning. Upon hitting yes, it will let us proceed and we will be brought here. So this is a very similar screen to what we are just at, but note that we are now looking at a credit note arrangement. So this is sort of a hint that these are very much like reverse invoices, with the same sort of interface, but in this case, we're reflecting money being put out of the system rather than money coming in. The line items have automatically filled, so we can immediately tell we owe the student $4,100 back. We need to give it out to them from our accounts. Much like an invoice, this credit note is actually in a draft state. You can see the number here is auto. There is no credit note number issued. We need to do that to record a refund against it. So to do that, I'm going to head down to the bottom here, tick this, and upon hitting save, it should generate that number. There we go, credit number CN001. Remember, this is drawing from the seed, prefix, and padding that we set up at the start in our system settings. So if you're not happy with how that's generating, just check those settings as they were, assuming you're doing this in staging initially to test with. If you're not happy with that, you can then refine what you'd like to do when you do the setup in the live environment. Once a credit note has been raised and its number issued, it's now ready to receive a refund. So like with payments, that would normally be managed in some sort of external system. Either you literally give the cash back to the student or you do a direct transfer to say, yeah, here's the money back to you. Once that has been performed externally, you can then record a refund against the credit note in aXcelerate to say, yeah, that's been done. So don't have this balance outstanding saying you still owe this student money. That's all being cleared off. I'll hit record refund, like so. And then works very much like the payments. The difference here is that we're reflecting money going out to the student rather than money they're paying in. We could say this was a direct debit. We just gave it straight back to them. And similarly, you could also reduce that if you're doing the refunds in chunks. You could do a partial refund. Assuming in this case, it makes more sense to do it as a whole. And we could also put in a receipt number to reflect, that transaction that's happened. By hitting save refund, it will then apply it. And now the note has been marked as credited. So at this point, we're saying for this particular aspect, we do not owe the student any more money. We have refunded or credited out any balance that they may have had that they'd already paid in. From here, you may be wondering that, oh, I'm trying to keep track of a lot of finance for this student. What if they've got a few refunds, maybe they're in a couple different courses? It can be sort of difficult to keep track of things if they're in multiple areas. So especially when it comes to tracking refunds and overall balance, probably the best place to do that is their financial summary. To do that, I'm going to navigate back to Andrew over here. Excellent. And we've been seeing so far that a lot of the invoices and such are attached to courses, either full qualifications or against their workshop enrollments. And that's definitely the case when you're trying to raise invoices. But if you want to see it all holistically, if you hover over an actions menu here against a contact, you'll be able to access the finance option for a summary. Upon clicking that, we can now see all the financial behavior for Andrew in one place. We can see here the invoice that was raised, the amount that was for, and then shortly after that, a record of payment like so. There was then a credit note raised shortly after that for the same amount. He wanted all his money back. And then immediately following there was the debit put out as we refunded the student. Very handily from this screen, you can actually click these blue links to get through to the invoices or credit notes of interest. So we could go through in here and immediately check out this invoice's details and potentially even resend it if we so wanted. A word of caution, if I return back to the finance summary area, I will point out there are these two options up the top here. Please bear in mind, this is not really designed for managing the finance for enrollments. As we've been seeing throughout this lesson, when you're raising an invoice for a course, an enrollment into something, that should be done either from the class enrollment or from the workshop booking. I do not recommend raising invoices from this summary screen. That will create an invoice, but it will just be floating in isolation. So the system will have no concept that it belongs to a specific course. Thus, it's generally not recommended practice. Same for the credit notes. If you raise a credit note in isolation, it can be hard to relate that back. It is best to create your credit notes from the invoices that have payments against them with this more option like so. For those wondering, the reason we have this here is for short ad hoc invoicing. So if you wanted to maybe put out an invoice for a certificate reissuance, there may be no enrollment that's actually specific for it. It's just an ad hoc thing you do maybe years after someone's been booked in with you. In those cases, it's often best to firstly create the additional item, so an item for a certificate reissuance fee. And that's probably one of the few cases I recommend raising a standalone invoice just for that particular fee. But that's how to process your refunds. Hopefully there aren't going to be too many of those. Remember that was mainly done by going to an invoicing question that has payments, and from there you should be able to raise a relevant credit note before recording a payment, or rather a refund against it in that case. That pretty much concludes it for everything here today. So I'll just recap briefly what we've come through, and I'll let you go and on to the wonderful world of finance. Alright, we've reached the end here today of setting up and using the basic finance features of aXcelerate in today's lesson. To summarize, we have looked at some of the key settings for today, namely around setting up your prefixes and padding for your invoices and credit notes. We've looked at setting up finance codes to determine what certain amounts are, and we've examined where to set the pricing for qualifications for full courses and for workshops where you may be running sort of short courses there. For non-tuition stuff, we've also examined the items list, so any non-tuition stuff gets put in here for later use in invoicing. In that regard, we've seen our invoicing should generally be done from specific enrolments, be they enrolments into classes for students studying full qualifications, or bookings into workshops for those of you with short course arrangements. Remember that we have the public style coordination when you're invoicing individual students within a workshop, and then the in-house arrangement where you're trying to send one bulk invoice to a designated client contact. From raising invoices, we've also examined how we can send those out of aXcelerate by using the template feature of the interface. We've also seen how you can record payments against them to reflect different transactions going on outside the system so that aXcelerate knows when people and clients are paying for their courses. Furthermore, we've seen how we can raise credit notes for paid invoices that facilitates tracking refunds within the aXcelerate system. And we've also seen how you can use the financial summary against any contact in here to look at how they're tracking overall in finance if they're maybe enrolled in a bunch of different courses within the system. Throughout all of this, we have been keeping ourselves to the staging environment so that we can safely practice the setup, as we've seen that with certain things, especially those seeds from before, those simply cannot be changed once you've set them in the system. So it's critical to understand and practice all this in staging first before you commit to setup in the live environment. From today, however, you should be able to proceed with, firstly, in the live environment, setting up the templates for your invoices and the messages those are attached to. Very safe to do that in there. You should also be able to go through and begin setting up the pricing for your full qualifications or your workshop types, depending on whether you run full classes, short courses, and or both. I do strongly recommend practicing the majority of this in staging so that you've got a solid understanding of the system before committing to live, but those templates and prices are generally safe to do beforehand. I appreciate you may have questions on some of the more advanced ways of doing things. Perhaps your pricing structure is a bit more complicated than what we've seen today. And furthermore, some of you may have access to government funding that you need to track as well for reporting requirements. We'll be addressing those in later lessons through features such as the payment plans and finance models. If interested, do feel free to check out our help documentation on those topics to start getting some idea of that. Whether you're looking to use those or a future integration with, say, MYOB, Xero accounting software, I hope today has given you a good understanding how the base level financing and invoicing works in aXcelerate, as this is generally key to understanding how those advanced features need to work. If you have any more pointed questions that the documentation can't really answer for you, do feel free to reach out to your onboarding consultant with your specific scenarios, and they can troubleshoot what invoicing system will work best for you in aXcelerate. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching all of you in a future lesson sometime soon. Take care for now.
Thanks for joining us today for the aXcelerate Learning Series. We hope this session was informative. Now go to the description box below and book your spot on the live Q&A session. We also value any suggestions and feedback, so you can also find our feedback link in the description box below. See you next time.